Well, good morning, family, and welcome. This year marks 230 years since Mary Wade was put on a leaky ship and sent to Australia, and it's 160 years since she passed away at the ripe old age of 84. And tomorrow, coincidentally, marks exactly to the day the 230th anniversary of when she left Cape Verde on the third last leg of her voyage to Australia. I'm proud to be her descendant, and I'm very privileged to be standing here and speaking today, and for that I'd like to thank all of the committee for inviting me to do so. I spoke at Port Macquarie and I went over time, but I'm on the clock today. So I'll get a wind up if I go. I think I've got about 3 minutes per page, so I'll see if I can stick to that. What I want to do today, most people already know the bare bones of Mary's life story, so I just want to add a bit of colour to her life, what she went through in England and in Australia. And for that I must acknowledge the publication Mary Wade to Us, which is now about 35 odd years old. So any information that's repetitive, I don't claim that as my own. I've sourced that from the book. I'm just adding a few extras, and I'm going to spend a bit of time too about how Mary's parents were discovered, and that does contradict what's in the book, but rereading the book, I think the book itself was never 100% certain that that was the case. I'm going to talk about her early years from the time she was arrested and the discovery of her parents and the kind of life that they had. That's very well documented, and we're very lucky we come from a convict because their lives were pretty well documented. And comparing her trial records and the examination records prior to going to trial, I think they're as lengthy as any that I've seen. You see a lot of them that are just a couple of paragraphs, but hers are quite lengthy, and when you drill down on just simple little sentences, you can get a bit of an idea about her. Unfortunately in Australia, don't mind me, I thought it was working.
This one will work better.
Okay, is that better? Or
a little bit closer to it.
Oh, it's very Freudian, David. As far as Mary's life in Australia, there's not a lot documented, and it can really only be seen through the lives of the men in her family, as it was their generally unextraordinary lives that were documented, and I'm positive that her life was a little bit more extraordinary than theirs. I always have a bit of a laugh when I started getting into this. I discovered that my mother's great-grandfather, there was a newspaper report when his missing chickens were found. But if it was Mary's missing chickens, it wouldn't have gone reported. I should just say that that is not Mary Wade. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, that's actually a still from the BBC documentary Floating Brothel. Anyway, I think Mary did make her mark in Australia, neither as a notorious criminal, which she once was, or a particularly outstanding citizen, except for the fact that she and Jonathan, that we know of, they and their children turned their lives around. They still had their occasional brush with the law and officials. So my interest in Mary Wade does go back a fair way, and this is just for a laugh. Oh, you said the space bar. There we are. I think when I learned about colonial Australia and visited old Sydney town when I was 12 years old, that's when it all got started. It did go through to the keeper back then, but around about the same time, one of my grandmothers said to me, "You are related to royalty." And that meant nothing to me then either, but when I got interested about 20 years ago, that came back to me, and I thought, I think I'll go searching for that. Well, I did discover on my father's side a by marriage connection of the first King of Scotland, but the royalty that I found was Mary Wade. I'll focus now on how Mary's parents were discovered, and a great deal of work is undertaken. I would say it's a 30-plus year job because of what the Webb family did to look for Mary's parents. Other than a baptism record, which might have been attributable to a different Mary Wade, there is no known document that I have found that conclusively names her parents, i.e. it's not on her death record, but there's nothing other than this baptism record that was found in more recent years. And there were several, there were many Mary Wades born in the London area, but we can infer from the death certificate that she was born in Westminster. And I don't think that was quite specific to me, that it was Westminster, and that really was the first and last place to begin the search for her parents. The area where Mary lived was about 350 metres southwest of Westminster Abbey, and there a gentleman by the name of Lawrence and his wife Mary raised their family in one of the most deprived parts of London. It was bleak. Westminster originated in medieval times and it occupies much of central London, and its name comes from the informal description of the Church of St Peter, otherwise known as Westminster Abbey, and it describes an area no more than about 1.5 kilometres from the Abbey and the Palace of Westminster, immediately to the west of the Thames River. I think I've got a picture, just a map of the area later. The area around Westminster Abbey, there was an area around the Abbey that was known as the Sanctuary, and this is where people who were fleeing persecution, the constables, legal proceedings against them, or a displeased king would flee to this place called the Sanctuary, where they would be given safe haven. And prior to the 18th century, Westminster was considered a desirable place to live, but by the time of Lawrence and Mary Wade, the gardens and courtyards had been built over, the streets were poorly paved, the dwellings were made with the cheapest material, they were run down, they had poor lighting, inadequate drainage and sanitation, and disease was rife. Westminster became notorious for its rundown and narrow streets, and rundown dwellings. And the area around Great Peter Street, Old Pie Street, Perkins Rents, where we can place Mary and Lawrence and her mother Mary, and a couple of other streets in that tight little area, were known to be the worst in London and in Westminster. And we don't really have contemporary records of that area of about the 1750s, or at least in the 18th century, but several generations later, where I have discovered that the Wade family, descendants of the Wade family, were still living, there are some contemporary descriptions of the area. In 1850, Cardinal Wiseman, who was an Archbishop of Westminster, he described the area as follows. Now, this is the exact area where Mary grew up. Close under the Abbey of Westminster there lie concealed labyrinths of lanes and courts, and alleys and slums, nests of ignorance, vice, depravity and crime, as well as of squalor, wretchedness and disease, whose atmosphere is typhus, whose ventilation is cholera, in which swarms of huge and almost countless population, nominally at least Catholic, they are haunts of filth, which no sewage committee can reach, dark corners which no lighting board can brighten. So that's a pretty bleak picture of the area. I found this just a couple of months ago. And did you bring your laser pointer? No, we didn't.
It's green, it's illegal in this country.
This is an engraving by an artist called Gustave Doré. And it depicts the area known as the Devil's Acre, which name came from Charles Dickens around about the same time. What I've been able to work out, and I'm sorry, I'm going to go to this screen, Mary lived in Perkins Rents. Up there is Old Pie Street. There, the dishevelled dwellings, there's a chapel there, and that is Westminster Abbey. This building here still stands today, and it's called the Rochester Buildings, and it was a philanthropic development for the poor people of the area. It no longer is, it's housing for rich Londoners, I suppose. That was built directly on top of Perkins Rents and Pump Court, where Mary Wade lived. So if you go up to the end of the building and turn right, that's roughly where Mary lived. I'll just quickly read out a description of Charles Dickens and what he described the Devil's Acre as. The most lordly streets are frequently but a mask for the squalid districts which lie behind them, while spots consecrated to be the most hallowed of purposes are begirt by scenes of indescribable infamy and pollution. The blackest tide of moral turpitude that flows in the capital rolls its filthy wavelets up to the very walls of Westminster Abbey. and the lawmakers, for 1/7 of the human race, sit night after night in deliberation in the immediate vicinity of the most notorious haunt of lawbreakers in the empire. There is no district in London more filthy and disgusting, is more steeped in villainy and guilt than that on which every morning sun casts the sombre shadows of the Abbey, mingled as they soon will be, with those of the gorgeous towers of the new Palace of Westminster. There's a little bit more, but I guess I'm over the 6 minutes for my 2 pages. And just to press the point home a bit, you won't be able to read the street names necessarily, but in 1889, so we are a bit out of Mary's time now, but the place didn't change. They had slum clearances, pardon me, in about the mid-19th century. Charles Booth developed what he called his poverty map of London, and I've just taken a bit of a segment of that. And I won't go through all the colour codes, but the black square that I've popped in is roughly the Devil's Acre, and the red circle is where Mary lived. And the black sections within that square are what he recorded as the most deprived and poorest parts of the area, and it's smack bang over where Mary lived. Meanwhile, half a kilometre up the road, Londoners just enjoyed life. Now I'll just spend a couple of moments discussing how we tracked down Mary's parents. Various sources showed that Lawrence Wade and his family lived in the same parish where it was felt Mary would have been baptised or unbaptised, sometime in the mid-1770s. Her 1859 death certificate states she was born in Westminster, and this is also where she was known to be living when she was arrested in 1789. There are a couple of plausible alternatives, but when you dig a bit deeper, they're not so. The origin of the discovery of her parents happened about 20 years ago, and some of you may be familiar with Sandy McCoy and Jenny Hodges on the Facebook group. Jenny knew, through the Claim a Convict website, she was contacted by a London magistrate who had read the Mary Wade to Us book and thought she was a descendant of Mary Wade, and she wanted to research Mary and give a presentation to some of the people in the prisons in present day London to help them turn their lives around just as Mary did. So she made contact with Jenny, and then because she was on the ground in London and she had access to all of the criminal records, she went from court to court, she went from parish to parish church, and finally she discovered a marriage of Lawrence Wade and Mary Smith, and 4 children born to them, the first one being our Mary, who was born, and Lawrence and Mary Smith were actually already expecting Mary when they got married at St John the Evangelist Church. That's just a contemporary picture of Westminster Abbey, and I think this area here was known as the Sanctuary, and that there is St Margaret's Church, where the Wade family were parishioners and where Mary and her siblings were baptised. So the family basically had to walk through the grounds of Westminster Abbey in order to get to church. Now that we've established that Lawrence and Mary are the true parents of Mary Wade, further research shows that Mary Wade might not have been the first person in her family to fall foul of the law. In late 1774, before Mary was born, there was a gentleman named Lawrence Wade and 2 other accomplices at least, who went on a bit of a crime spree through Surrey, Essex, Chelmsford, which I think is Essex, and eventually they were arrested and sentenced to death and they were hanged, all three men on the same day, and buried at a church in Holborn. Now, his name was Lawrence Wade. He attended court in Essex, which is not that far from London, but back in those days people didn't really move around a lot. But what I've been able to work out is that of their crime spree all over the broader London area, the first court case for the first crime is held in each parish where the crime took place. So they were dragged to Chelmsford, Essex, found guilty of one of the first of the string of robberies, and they were hanged. Prior to that, this Lawrence Wade had been brought to the courthouse from Tothill Fields Prison, which was literally at the end of the street where Mary Wade lived. So that when he was arrested, he would have been put in his local prison, and then when it came to face trial in the parish where he committed the crime, he was taken there, found guilty and hanged with his mates. A little later on, in 1781, another man named Lawrence Wade was accused of stealing sheep from a paddock, a common paddock, in Tothill Fields, which was literally the street below where Mary lived. And this was a common paddock where drovers, for example, would adjust their sheep or run or feed up their cattle prior to going to market. And the story went that this Lawrence Wade walked into the paddock and took some sheep out that had been left there earlier that morning, only until the servant of the original owner came back to collect the sheep. He noticed them missing and asked the field keeper, "Where are my sheep?" And the field keeper said, "Well, Lawrence Wade took them." So he named Lawrence by name, meaning he knew him, but he never raised the alarm when Lawrence Wade took them. So that tells me that Lawrence was a familiar face in Tothill Fields, and that backs up the story that Mary's mother said at her trial, that I have a husband, he is a drover. And that sort of takes me back to how we discovered Lawrence. The original attribution of George Wade as being Mary's father, he died before this court trial of Mary. So when Mary's mother got up in court and said, "I have a husband, he is a drover," that's present tense. So it can't be the George Wade that was the original attribution. I don't think that accusation of the stolen sheep went any further. I cannot find any trial record. So my view is that the field keeper knew him, did not raise the alarm when he saw Lawrence take the sheep. I think it was just mistaken identity. Not of Lawrence, but the sheep. I think Lawrence was a drover, so I think he probably went into the paddock and just took the wrong sheep. Although why, when he realised they were the wrong sheep, he didn't return them within 2 days. I can't come up with a theory behind that one. So that means around that time, the reason I'm convinced that's Mary's father, if it isn't, there were 3 men named Lawrence Wade in Westminster around the same time. The one that was hanged for the crime spree, Mary's father, and the one that stole the sheep. It's possible, but I think it would be quite rare because Westminster did not have a huge population at the time. Maybe 250,000, I think, as best as I can work out. And the name Lawrence is fairly unique. Wade, perhaps not so much. Parish records show that Mary's father was 39 when he died in Perkins Rents in 1794. And that's another link to him definitely being Mary's father, because that's the address that she put on the receipt when she pawned the stolen clothes. And this suggests he was born around 1755, presumably in Westminster. There are a few candidates as to who his parents might be. His father possibly was a mariner from Whitechapel. And Mary's mother was probably born in 1753 based on her stated age of 83 when she died in 1836. That's 5 years before the 1841 census, which is a terribly difficult census to get too much information out of. However, Mary's mother died at a place called 8 New Court, And 8 New Court is literally, again, the street beside Perkins Rents. So I'm convinced that's Mary's mother. The age fits as well. The 1841 census shows a Thomas Smith living at 5 New Court. Now, Smith was the maiden name of Mary's mother. So there's a connection there that we might be able to trace. And in this multi-occupancy housing complex, at number 8 New Court, there was a family named Wade living there as well. So that's a lead for me to work on. How are we going? 15 to go. Oh, okay. So my view, and I'm sure most others' view, is that Mary was almost certainly born into poverty and hardship, and this saw her take to the streets of London to beg for money and to sweep the streets, much as though her mother denied that was the case when she went to court. And alongside the likes of John Kelly, who was Ned Kelly's father, Francis Greenway, the colonial architect, and Mary Bryant, who was one of the first successful escapees from the colony, Mary has become one of the most researched Australian convicts of early colonial Australia. And a great deal, or small glimpses of her childhood is in the transcript of her trial at the Old Bailey. And it was this record that told us that her mother came from a large family of butchers and that her father was a drover. And that's another connection as well, that the mother was a butcher, the mother came from a family of butchers, the father was a drover. And on my research of butchers back in those days, there were sort of three levels of butchers, and unfortunately I think the family of butchers was at the lowest rung, and that Lawrence Wade himself as a drover was simply a butcher's drover, which simply meant that once cattle was sold up at Smithfield cattle markets or the meat markets up in Smithfield, he would simply take them back to the butcher shops or to slaughterhouses where they would be slaughtered for sale. Now, shadowed by Westminster Abbey and Buckingham Palace, and with a broom in her hand, Mary swept the streets and begged for money in parts of London that were frequented by society's elite, aristocrats, church leaders, lawmakers and politicians amongst them. Mary would also go to the Treasury very often to get 2 or 3 halfpence, and in order to get there she would have to cross Downing Street, which was the official residence of the Prime Minister. That there is a picture of the Treasury, and that's the building where Mary committed her crime in 1789. A very, very frosty evening in 1789, Mary and her 16-year-old friend, or probably her cousin, Jane Whiting, assaulted a little girl called Mary Phillips, who had gone up to the Treasury to get a bottle of water, to fill a bottle of water for her brother. Their mother was out at the time. The little boy, he was older than this child, but he sent her up there to get the bottle of water. My research shows that the previous night was freezing. The newspapers described the parks as looking lovely and glistening with their frost-coloured branches, but all the lead pipes in the metropolis had burst. So I think that's why the little girl went up to the Treasury to find some running water. There was probably a well there. Mary lived in a place called Pump Court in Perkins Rents, which almost certainly was named for the fact that there was a pump there. And I'm thinking that the Treasury had the only running water after all the pipes had burst. So, but for the freezing cold weather, this may never have happened. We may never have been here. So the little girl went up there to fill the bottle of water, and she was approached by Mary and her friend Jane, and they offered to fill it for her, but instead they broke it, and then they promised to refill it. So they found a boy that they knew that was loitering around the premises as well, sent him off to fill the bottle. Meanwhile, they stripped the child of all of her clothes, her 2 petticoats, her cap, her frock, and what's known as a tippet, which is an old-fashioned shawl. The girl started crying, of course. She eventually ran home into the arms of her mother, who was waiting outside wondering where her daughter was. They did return the 2 petticoats to her and let her put them back on. On their way home, they passed not only the street where their victim lived, but they passed through an area called the Armoury, which was also connected to Westminster Abbey, where alms for the poor were handed out. So they would have known that area very well, and there was a pawnbroker's shop there. And they stopped in there, these 2 little girls, and pawned the frock for 18 pence. They split the money. Mary then took the cap and the shawl home with her, and from the reading of the transcript of the trial, I'm convinced she lived in a 1-room house with her parents and 3 other siblings. And it wasn't until they started, I think Mary was out in the street wearing the cap, and they came across a woman, and I don't think they bragged about it, but they did admit to this lady that they stole the clothes from a girl. And that woman eventually went to the constable, or went to the family's home to let them know, and the constables turned up to Mary's room, as it said in the transcript of the trial, and there on a chair they found the shawl, and it was that bit of damning evidence and the clothes, the frock that was still at the pawnbrokers, that saw Mary convicted and sentenced to hang. I don't know if you can see that terribly clearly. Sorry, I'm going to use this one again. They are the fields where Lawrence Wade stole the sheep. That's the prison where the other Lawrence Wade was taken before he was hanged, and it's also the prison where Mary would have been put after her arrest. That's where Mary lived. That's where Jane Whiting lived, her friend. That's where she'd been baptised, and we'll talk about that later. Charles Street is where her victim lived, and that's the Treasury area that they went to when they stole the clothes from the little girl. During the court trial, well, Mary and Jane were charged with highway robbery, and the punishment for that is death. And the court addressed Mary's mother, who lied about Mary's age, and there's 2. I now know it's a lie for several reasons. One, we found the baptism record, and in the transcript of the examination of the witnesses, Mary gave her age as 12, and at the actual trial, her mother tried to convince the judge that she was only 10. Not only that, Jane Whiting, her co-accused, also lied about her age. So the suggestion is that they'd been up before and possibly knew what fate awaited them, and that the lower age that they had might get them a reprieve from the gallows. But they questioned Mary's mother about her age, and she maintained the lie by asserting that her daughter was not yet 11. She did say that Mary's daughter fell in December, so it became a bit of a white lie, because Mary's baptism record shows that she was born in December, and that also helped us link her to Lawrence. During the trial, I'm not going to read the trial, but this struck home with me. The court issued Mary's mother with a very stern warning. I can hardly ask you how your child has behaved, for I'm afraid you're as much at fault as she is, by not taking proper care of her and keeping her at home and making her industrious. Letting her run about the streets was a sure way to lead her to the place where she is now. Therefore, I ought rather to ask you, what can you say for yourself than for her? And Mary's mother said, it is the other girl that induces her out, when my back is turned, to go a-begging with her. I never brought her up to go begging. All the butchers know me well. You can interpret that any way you want. I have a great family of them. And then the court said, I hope you will take better care of the rest, or else they will all come to the gallows. So long before the verdict had been handed down, the judge had already said basically she's going to the rope. The judge addressed the jury, and I think he guided them somewhat to their verdict. He said that the assault and robbery on a younger girl, by two young girls on a much younger girl, was the equivalent of holding a pistol to the breast of a grown person. And in directing the jury, he added, the tender years of these persons may be a circumstance to be attended to in other views. But as to the denomination of the crime, I think it would be a dangerous thing to society, if you were to be induced by any humanity, to lower the offence at all below that of actual robbery. So that if you say they are both, or either of them guilty, I think you must say they are guilty of the crime for which they stand indicted, robbery and not larceny. So larceny drew a lesser consequence. So Mary and Jane were found guilty and they were both sentenced to death by hanging. That's the new drop gallows at Newgate Prison. I think that had only been specially built around the time that Mary was due to hang. Prior to her hanging, she probably would have been kept in solitary confinement to reflect on her crime. Between 1781 and 1790, more than 1,000 people were sentenced to death at the Old Bailey, but less than half were actually executed, and only 5% of them were women. So there were some odds in favour of Mary getting a reprieve, and we know the outcome. At that rate, Mary and Jane stood a good chance of avoiding the noose. In early 1789, King George III was said to be suffering from a recurrence of the mental illness that afflicted him for much of his later life. And he may not have been capable of hearing any claims for mercy from anybody that might care to represent Mary. However, I should just add, excluding executions in 1789, a total of 92 inmates from a population of 600 in Newgate died. So statistically, the girls were a 1 in 15 chance of dying even before the rope went around their neck. In March 1789, some of the prisoners at Newgate who had been convicted at the January sessions with Mary received the grim news that they would hang in a week's time. So the day was drawing near. Mary and Jane were not on that list, but their future was still bleak because the Recorder of London, James Adair, had simply placed their name on a list of prisoners whose execution date had simply been postponed. So there was too many to go up on that at once. Mary first appeared in the jail register as capital convicts in the cells, which means death awaited. On March 9, respited was annotated against her name, which simply meant that this had just confirmed that her death date had been postponed. And this happened to coincide with the many public announcements that Mad King George had recovered his health. And the government, by way of celebrating his return to health, not only had fireworks shows and music festivals and all sorts of things, it was also recommended that some of the women on death row be reprieved, because this was around about the same time where America was no longer a viable place to send convicts. The prisons were overflowing, or you could drop them off the gallows or you could send them to another country, and Australia had recently been settled. So the girls got the good news. Their name appeared with 24 other prisoners on a list asking the king to reprieve them, which was approved. And thus Mary was spared the noose and was told that she would be put on a boat and sent to Australia. I just wanted to describe the conditions in the prison. They probably were then moved to the general cells with the rest of the population, and they would have been sleeping next to each other. No beds, no blankets unless they could afford to buy one. They probably just slept on damp, wet hay. They'd probably been advised earlier when the official notification came through. The cells They were in the communal wards and possibly were shackled, ankle to ankle. Their friends in prison were half naked, deranged, drunk, prostitutes, all level of criminals. The communal wards were so crowded that each prisoner had no more floor space than about 20 inches in width on which they could sleep. There were no lavatories in the cells, and the lack of food and hygiene meant that disease and illness was rampant. The prison was so dirty and squalid that the floor crunched as people walked over lice and bugs that just walked across the floor. So Mary's relief that she would now not be executed was probably tempered by the knowledge, the realisation that she would probably never again see her family after leaving England. She and Jane would sail to Port Jackson in New South Wales on the convict ship Lady Juliana, which had been specifically chartered to transport up to 250 female convicts from all over England as part of the Second Fleet. Mary remained categorised on the prison records under convicts respited until the 4th of May, when she was marked as having been removed to transport. I think there's another record a couple of days later to show that she was then put on the boat, or the Lady Juliana, which was really no bigger than a Sydney harbour ferry, with 250 women on board roughly, and I think 37 officers and a few extra crewmen. So I think it took a couple of days to get out the transports, and actually on the way up here, we were in Eden. Down here. Then we went to Eden and then came back. Went to Whale Museum, and in the gift shop in the Whale Museum was the book, The Floating Brothel, and I bought it and I started reading it. And it's just a wonderful read, what they tell you about and the descriptions that they give to people. And I learnt from that the women were put in a cart from the prison, taken down along the banks of the Thames, then put in a boat and rowed across to the Lady Juliana that was docked on the other side of the river. And the river was teeming with ships, and I think that's why there was the delay. They were just teeming with warships and transport ships and all sorts of things. So it was literally a couple of mile journey from the jail to the ship, but it took 2 or 3 days just to get on there. So there was a bit of an indicator as to how long Mary's voyage was going to be. It's nearly break time. I just quickly wanted to say there was a prison reformer a few years after Mary's time who used to visit Newgate Jail to help the women prisoners. And her name was Elizabeth Fry, and in 1816 she worked with the prison. But this is how she described how women were taken out of the prison to the prison ships. Frequently, batches of female convicts were dispatched to New South Wales, and according to the custom at Newgate, departure was preceded by total disregard of order. Windows, furniture, clothing, all were wantonly destroyed, while the procession from the prison to the convict ship was one of brutal, debasing riot. The convicts were conveyed to Deptford or other places in open wagons, accompanied by the rabble and scum of the populace. These crowds follow the wagons, shouting to the prisoners, defying all regulations and inciting them to more defiance of the rules. Some of the convicts were laden with irons, others were chained together by twos. It was pretty horrendous stuff. Is it break time?
I'll just have a word first.
Okay. Part 1 over. We'll leave that
Thanks for...
Was it ever on?
That's the new one.
Oh. Never was on.
Yeah, no, it sounds good. You're great.
Could
You came across that. Check one too. Okay, that's the second mic down. Can everyone hear me? Okay, thanks very much again, Stephen. And we're going to be hearing from Stephen after the break. But before we do, I'll call you back to order and we'll continue on. And Stephen will be taking over from after morning tea. I don't eat too much because you've got lunch ahead. I was actually considering going on an almond diet, but
Here we
that's
go.
nuts.
Mary boarded the Lady Juliana. There was a delay of about 6 months in the Thames until it finally left the Thames. And her voyage was the next fleet to arrive in Australia after the first fleet, and it is quite historically significant. The Lady Juliana took on board women from jails all over England that were being emptied to complete her cargo. By the end of March or early April, about 150 women had been embarked, and others came from different prisons, as well as Newgate, of course. I think it was the only ship of the second fleet that was not owned by slave traders. It was purpose-built and designed. The ship finally got out of the Thames estuary and down into the North Sea. And with that came the extraordinary news that 7 of the women that had been put on death row preferred instead to hang rather than join the rest of the women on board. Before they left the Thames, the government agent was discharged for his cruel treatment to the women. He'd begun flogging them, so he was replaced. And that man's name was Thomas Edgar, and he had previously sailed with Captain Cook, and he was said to be very humane, as was the doctor, or the surgeon, the ship's surgeon, and the ship's steward, John Nichol, who we are very fortunate 30 years later, he wrote his autobiography because he fell on hard times when he retired in Scotland, and he was convinced by a friend to write his autobiography of all of his ship voyages. And there's a good number of pages devoted to his voyage on the Lady Juliana. He talks about a number of the prisoners and the behaviour and what went on the ship. Unfortunately, Mary doesn't get a mention. I thought she might have because of her young age, but it's a really good read. Of their arrival in Port Jackson, John Nichol wrote, "We made the land on the 3rd of June, just 1 year all but 1 day after leaving the river." This implies the ship left on the 4th of June 1789, but from the maths that I've done, I think the entire voyage, or so I should say from the moment that Mary was put on board the ship, she spent 401 days on the boat. I was going to spend a bit of time on the voyage, but you can see the route there. I'll skip to the interesting bits. The women were allowed to wear their own clothes. They could not put them on until they left the English Channel. Usually they would be jettisoned overboard and they would have to wear coarse serge dresses, convict uniform, and that would be it. The ship's captain, master, made some of the women make shirts during the voyage, which he then sold at a huge profit once he landed in Australia. But they were given some duties and work and education along the way. The ship was kept clean and fumigated. They had daily access to fresh water, and every port they stopped in, they were given food, vegetables, fruit, and men. And in fact, one slave trading ship followed them from one stop of the leg all the way to the next leg because they knew what they would get when they landed. Most of the women had 7-year sentences, and 24 had life sentences, of which that was Mary and Jane. Around 36 had originally been sentenced to death, and most of those had been commuted to only 7 or 14 years, but Mary's was commuted only to life, which again underscores the severity of her crime. John Nichol wrote of these convicts as being mostly petty criminals, and he added that whilst there were not a lot of very bad characters, a large proportion of them were prostitutes, and some of them had even boasted of murder. None of the women had actually been convicted for prostitution. So that tells me that the economic necessity for many of the poor women to resort to prostitution was accepted by England, but when it came to them stealing their belongings, they could not tolerate that. And that was for survival. I'll just get to the point where the Lady Juliana sailed into South Africa. That was the last leg of her voyage, and there was a delay there at a lot of their stops, but when they stopped there were two incredible stories that are part of our history that Mary was peripherally involved in. The first one was the supply ship Guardian, that was part of the Second Fleet, had sailed after Mary left England on the Lady Juliana, but it overtook the Lady Juliana and arrived in South Africa before her, and then it set sail, and shortly out of the Cape they sailed close to an iceberg because they wanted to get some fresh water from the iceberg, but instead they sailed into it, and the rudder was ripped off, there was a gash in the side, and it started to sink, and it was carrying about 70,000 pounds worth of tools, clothes, food for the colony. So this was an absolute disaster, and it has been written up as that century's Titanic disaster. On board that ship was the Prime Minister's cousin, only about 25 convicts and some free settlers and officers, and about, I can't remember the numbers, but about 2/3 of them were given permission to jump in the jolly boats. Not that they were getting their jollies, but they were given permission to hop into these boats and just try and save themselves. And the captain said, I'm going to stick to this and I'm going to rescue the ship. And eventually they were able to drag a sail under the hull and stem the flooding and man the pumps. And it took, I think, 7 weeks or more to sail back to the Cape. Just slightly north of the Cape where the Lady Juliana was, and she arrived a couple of weeks later. So the surviving crew members and convicts were put on board the Lady Juliana for the last leg to Australia, and for their good behaviour, the convicts that survived the Guardian were given immediate freedom when they arrived in Australia. The other interesting story is 2 months before Mary arrived and the ship, there's a third good story actually. 2 months before Mary and the Lady Juliana arrived in Table Bay in Cape Town, William Bligh had sailed out of Table Bay on his way back to England to report the mutiny on the Bounty, and to then turn around and try and he would face a court-martial, which he got out of. He was regarded as a bit of a hero, I think, for surviving the mutiny. So he left there 2 months before Mary sailed in, but he was impatient to get back to England and probably would have been there when Mary arrived, because he'd arranged with other loyal crew members to meet him in Table Bay, and then they would all go back to England together. But he grew impatient. They were coming from, I forget the old term for it, but it's now Jakarta. That's the one, thank you, Batavia, yes. So a couple of weeks later, a couple of weeks before Mary arrived, these other loyal crewmen actually arrived in Table Bay, and they were kept there to help with the Guardian that was being emptied and salvaged, or attempted to salvage, and then all of the stuff stocked up on the Lady Juliana. So these people were in direct these people that went through the mutiny on the Bounty were in direct contact with Mary's boat, Mary's ship. So she would have been one of the first people to have heard about the mutiny on the Bounty. Another tale of survival, and I think Mary had at least half a dozen in her lifetime. A mere 2 weeks after the Lady Juliana sailed out of Table Bay, and it could have been around the same time because of the delays with the Guardian and whatnot, a hurricane hit Table Bay and drove a couple of ships up onto the shore and sunk a few others. So if the Lady Juliana was still in Table Bay when that hurricane came through, she could have been, who knows. Yes, we're still on topic. When Mary arrived in Australia, That is roughly the entire white population of the continent. In fact, it's probably less. It was about 2,500 people. So she went from a million plus population of London to that size population in Australia. So she really had a new life to get ready to get used to. So she was now 14, and her new life on the other side of the world had just begun. When she stepped off the Lady Juliana, she was among the very first female Europeans to have ever set foot on Australian soil. Prior to her arrival, when the first fleet arrived, the news filtered back to England that the population was about 1,200 in Australia. Within months of the arrival, 37 children were born to the female convicts. I should add, some babies were born on the voyage over. If I look at the timeline, I think it's because they were already pregnant when they left, and not so much from the slave trading ships that followed them into port and the men that they entertained as they had their stopovers. And those 37 children is roughly the exact equivalent of officers that were on board the Lady Juliana. Mary first went to Norfolk Island, which had recently been set up for two purposes: as a farm to feed the starving colony, and also to grow flax, to help England with their shipbuilding, because they were still undergoing wars with other countries. Flax and pine failed after Cook had reported that it was a wonderful place for these items, but it continued to be a farm, and I've not seen a research yet, but I've read from various sources, and it was offered to me this morning, that Mary's time on Norfolk, she was given a pig to look after. She would have been put out into the garden to work doing mundane tasks like picking grubs off food, off the plants. And she did that for a number of years, and it's there that she came across and met the two men who would feature most prominently in her life. Excuse me. I should also add another escape from a possible disaster. The ship that took Mary to Norfolk Island could not get direct to the island itself, and it had to moor offshore because of the surf. It was too dangerous, so all of the women were put in little boats and rowed to the shore, and one of them apparently was blown onto the rocks and dashed to bits, and 7 women lost their lives. So Mary probably saw that as well. Not only that, there was another ship that had gone to Norfolk Island, and it had been wrecked on the reef, and the skeleton of its hull was still visible to the oncoming boat that Mary was on to be landed. So she not only saw some of her friends drowned, the skeleton of a big supply ship, I think it was a Surprise, it was still visible on the shoreline. So the two men that Mary met, quick show of hands, who was at the Port Macquarie reunion? Now keep your hands, I beg your pardon, keep your hands up if you're not a Harrigan descendant. Okay, I'm going to call him Horgan. The people who are at the Port Macquarie reunion will know why, but we know him as Teague Harrigan. I think that was an alias or an anglicised name from his Irish origins. I'm going to refer to him as Horgan, and his first name is Thady. Mary met him first. He came over on the 3rd Fleet, as did Jonathan Brooker, on separate ships. They roughly landed on Norfolk Island about the same time, but Mary first had children with Thady. Thady had been sentenced to Australia for theft, and Jonathan Brooker, the second man in her life, had been, I think he had a string of convictions, and the judges decided enough was enough, and they banished him to Australia as well. So Mary first began her relationship with Thady, who was originally from Cork, and I've traced his parents. he was living in Bristol in the south of England in February 1789, when at the age of 15 he stole. He and two others were arrested and jailed and committed to stand trial for receiving some stolen goods. He escaped that charge, but within weeks he was charged with one of the other boys from the first crime for stealing a woolen coat valued at 20 shillings. And he was in Bristol prison for about 4 months before he faced trial, and he was found guilty and sentenced to 7 years in Australia. He spent another 15 months in prison before he was finally put on board a boat, or he was removed to Plymouth actually, sent down to Plymouth, and he was put on the Salamander, which was one of the 11 vessels that made up the Third Fleet. Less than a month after arriving, he was sent to Norfolk Island, where he duly met Mary. The second man in her life was Jonathan Brooker, and he was much older than Thady or Mary. I come from Jonathan, so I'm going to put that down to Mary picked him. So he must have been bloody good looking. Because I reckon Mary would have been a bit of a... You saw the first photo. Now, London...
Just look at us.
Yes. Well, you've got the blonde hair. Jonathan was a chair maker. Now, I haven't actually seen the record that says he's a chair maker, but I'll take that as read. And he was living somewhere in Surrey at the time of his arrest in 1790. And this is about 5 miles to the east of where Mary was living when she committed her crime 18 months earlier. He was imprisoned in the county jail and appeared in Kingston Court in Surrey 6 days later to face a charge of stealing upwards of 200 weight of glue, which I think is about 220 pounds or 100 kilos. And he stole that from a yard at Long Lane in Bermondsey in Surrey. And the glue was valued at £8, and it belonged to a glue maker called Thomas Ellis. Jonathan then sold it to Elizabeth Yardley, who dealt in old iron at 25 Mint Street. And she then sold it to Robert Manning, who had a lease in the same premises. Jonathan pleaded not guilty to stealing the glue, but the magistrate, as I said, I think, decided enough was enough because he had a bit of a rap sheet. He sentenced him to 7 years in Australia. He was probably kept on a prison hulk in the Thames, which was a shocking place to be. Just a little bit of quick self-indulgence, and for any of the Griffins that are amongst us today, on the left is the family tree of Jonathan Brooker and Mary Wade. Their daughter Elizabeth married Daniel Lowe. Their daughter Sophia married Daniel Griffin. Daniel Griffin's son Daniel married Joan Jackson. So if you go to the right-hand side of the tree, you go up to Joan Jackson's father was Robert Jackson. His mother was Mary Dommett, and her father was James Dommett. They are both my 5 times great-grandfathers. There's a connection there, because James Dommett was a glue maker, a candle maker, a chandler, and he worked at 25 Mill Street, which is where Jonathan sold his stolen glue. And so they probably came across each other. Also, James Dommett was the landlord of Elizabeth Yardley, who bought the glue from Jonathan Brooker. He was also a juryman in Surrey, where Jonathan was tried. And it's very likely he sat there and was part of the jury that sentenced Jonathan to 7 years in Australia. They probably didn't know each other. Jonathan might have tried to sell the glue to him because he was a glue maker and a candle maker. And it was about 80 years exactly later that their respective great-grandchildren got married and the two families became inextricably linked. We'll come back to the mainland now. I think Mary probably spent about 5 or 6 years on Norfolk Island. Several children were born there. I've got them here, but I need to speed up. Oh. Jonathan Thady had 7-year sentences, and if they behaved themselves, they would be free by servitude in 1797. The records show that Thady was granted his ticket of leave on Norfolk Island in 1796, and shipping records show that Thady, Jonathan, Mary, and the surviving children all came back on the ship together. At that point, Thady and Mary lived on a tent on the Tank Stream and had a couple of kids. At the same time, we believe that Mary had a child to Jonathan Brooker, but he was working for Dr. William Balmain, either in Sydney or Parramatta. Balmain, of course, is what Balmain in Sydney is named after. He also had connections to Cook. He had been sent to Norfolk Island around about the time that Jonathan and Mary and Thady were there, and I dare say that he got to know them over there and offered Jonathan a job when he got back to Sydney. And he was very much on the side of the convicts. Balmain had large farming estates in the Windsor, Richmond, Mulgrave Place area, or Green Hills as it was known then. And I think possibly Jonathan was working on that farm for him, even though he was a surgeon. He was in failing health and went back to England, so Jonathan's tenure with Balmain would not have lasted long. He also, I think, wanted to raise money to build a prison and a church, and Jonathan's skills as a carpenter, not only welcomed by the governor, who had actually written home to England to complain about the lack of carpenters, his skills as a carpenter would have been a welcome addition to the work roster of Dr. Balmain. In 1806, Thady Horgan appeared living alone on the muster, and with work scarce, he joined a whaling and sealing expedition in 1809. And about 15% of the population, the male population at the time, were involved in whaling and sealing. And because it took men away from their wives for long periods of time, that might have been what drove the wedge into Mary's relationship with Thady. And it's around that time that she's taken up with Jonathan Brooker. Some people think Thady died in Tasmania after he was granted land there in about 1825, but I have found references to him owing the government rent in the mid-1830s. After that, it's blank, but I think he probably was alive at some stage in the 1830s. That's Green Hills, Windsor. I'll very quickly go through that. A family story tells of a very heavily pregnant Mary Wade being carried by boat across the flooded river during one of the major floods that at one point had risen to 86, the river had risen to 86 feet over its normal level. And houses were washed away, destroyed. So that was probably Jonathan's first problems with the land that he was living on. A lot of the other Windsor relatives, including now family friends of the Brooker Wade family, decided enough was enough and they wanted to move 50 kilometres further south, and Jonathan got a land grant in Ayres, excuse me, and they eventually moved there. There's a little bit of doubt about the exact timing of that. I think what happened, we bring William Bligh back into the picture. He's come back to Australia. He was overthrown by a military coup, and any land grants that were handed out during his time, when Macquarie came in, he rescinded them all. So whilst Jonathan might have had land surveyed for him, I think that was put on hold while the interim government was, or the military government was running the colony until Macquarie came in. He then founded Liverpool, named that after his wife's family's estate. And he basically put an article in the local newspaper to say, if you're of sober nature, if you are honest, if you are a hard worker, I will give you back a land grant, or you can apply for a land grant. And the fact that we know Jonathan settled there, it sort of tells me that he had definitely turned his life around. I mentioned an earlier rap sheet, there's a bit of thuggery involved and more thefts there. But he was obviously able to provide his credentials to Macquarie and be given back the original land grant, or indeed another one. The land grant that Thady had in Tasmania indicates that he did not have another wife or any children with him, because he was given only 30 acres. So I don't think he ever remarried. There's a bit of confusion as well. The land grants that Jonathan were given did not seem to reflect what were handed out for a man with a wife and 4 or 5 children. He was given, I think, 90 acres, and he had some livestock and maize and corn and peas. In 1860, Jonathan was fast approaching 60, and he was responsible for supporting Mary and at least 4 children under the age of 10. The farm was well established, but their fortunes changed dramatically in the ensuing years. Jonathan twice in the next few years after 1820 petitioned Governor Macquarie for assistance. These appeals were written for him, and they described his circumstances. So this is a petition of Jonathan Brooker, stated that the petitioner arrived on the ship Atlantic now about 29 years ago. He's free by servitude. He has a wife and 7 children. And that again, if that's at the age 60, there's no way he had another, or Mary gave birth to more children to get us up to that 21 target that people think she might have had. 5 of those children he still has to support. He rents 12 acres of land, but he now desires to become a settler again. Most humbly prayeth that His Excellency may be pleased to grant the petitioner such portion of land and such other indulgences for the support of his family. And it was signed off saying the petitioner is honest and industrious, and was only compelled by necessity to part with his original land grant down in Liverpool. So it turns out that he was granted some land, and he went back to work as a farmer and probably doing a bit of carpentry work to build houses in the area. Then a bushfire raged through and destroyed everything. He had to go back to Macquarie and plead for more assistance. I should, if I can find it. Oh, on his first petition, that petition actually gets a mention in a book written by Alistair Davidson, or it might have been a study paper. And he wrote of Jonathan's petition, the interesting point is how the ex-convicts hoped to become settlers. The term in contemporary parlance indicated the individual's willingness to become amenable to the discipline of the regular and orderly law-abiding society. Being married with a family to support, of course, strengthened their claim and further indicated that they had settled down permanently. For these men, the ideology of reform and order had well and truly penetrated. And he wrote that about Jonathan's petition specifically. So he's agreeing that Jonathan had turned the corner. And I think they both had long before then. Jonathan and Mary and the children now moved down to the Illawarra. Excuse me. And they were given another land grant down there, and that's effectively where they spent their final days. But this was an absolute hotbed of crime and disorder and bush rangers, and the settlers down there were in absolute fear for their lives and their livelihood. But by then they were living on 50 acres of land at what was then known as Parra Meadow. It's now Fairy Meadow. And it was a hornet's nest of lawlessness and disorder, as I said. I think there was a population down there of just fewer than 400 people. And a writer to the Australian newspaper in March 1829 wrote, "The situation we were placed in was truly deplorable. The many sleepless nights we experienced, the losses we sustained by robbery every night, expecting it to be our last. Thus molested and annoyed by a gang of desperate fellows, 9 in number, who were at large in this district 3 months, and who scarcely left one farm, house or premises unplundered. The major part of them are fortunately apprehended, and I believe few, if any, are now seeking shelter in the wilds of this district from that impartial justice, which sooner or later takes over crime." So even then they weren't yet comfortable. Jonathan Brooker died on the 14th of March in 1833, and his body was buried 2 days later at St Peter's Church Cemetery in Campbelltown, which I visited on my way down. It was 50 kilometres north of Fairy Meadow, where he was living at the time, but it was the only consecrated burial place at the time, the closest consecrated burial place. For the next 2.5 decades, Mary lived with her sons James and Edward until her death on the 17th of December 1859. She died peacefully during the early hours, and she was found in her bed on what I believe would have been the day she would have celebrated her 84th birthday. Although she was in an advanced age, a coroner's inquest was held and it was determined that she died of natural causes. Her son Edward had received a land grant at Tarrawanna, and he built and developed there. He'd also donated part of his land for a church to be built, and her funeral was the first to be held at that church. Her body now lays in Pioneer Rest Park, which has been converted to a rose garden, so you can't visit the gravestone, unfortunately. Mary's death certificate stated she had 21 children, which I think is wrong. In fact, I'm certain it's wrong. At the time of her passing, she was said to have 7 surviving children, 43 grandchildren, 84 great-grandchildren, and 14 great-great-grandchildren. Mary has thousands of descendants spread across the globe and can count amongst them Kevin Rudd, as we know, John Edmondson, who was the first Australian to be awarded the Distinguished Victoria Cross for gallantry during World War II, posthumously, I think, of course. And for me, it's difficult to ignore the irony that Mary was once a guest of His Majesty in 1789, and 165 years later, 2 of his descendants, Elizabeth and Patricia Griffin, were guests of Her Majesty at the Royal Enclosure at Ascot in 1954. Much better accommodation. Mary lived in very difficult times. She survived poverty on the filthy streets of London, the black cloud of a death sentence which briefly hovered over her, a heart-wrenching separation from her family at the age of 13, an arduous and dangerous 10-month voyage across the open seas for the term of her natural life, to a new country on the brink of starvation, the birth of her first child on Norfolk Island at the age of 18, life in a tent on the banks of the Tank Stream in Sydney Cove, the perils of Hawkesbury River floods, and the searing heat, destructive bushfires, ruthless bush rangers, and some unfriendly natives at Aids and Fairy Meadow, before she finally came to rest in the Illawarra. Little did the Lord Chief Baron know that by sentencing Mary to death 70 years earlier, he was probably doing her the biggest favour she was ever likely to receive in her long life. But for the decision to spare her from the hangman's noose a couple of months after her death sentence was handed down, none of us would be here today. Just another bit of self-indulgence. In 1990, long before I got into the family history, my sister got married. We are all from Sydney. My sister got married and moved down to Campbelltown, or Woodbine it was, and I lived there for about a year. And 20 odd years later, I discovered that on either side of my sister's house, a 2-minute walk either side, is Mary Wade Reserve and Jonathan Brooker Reserve. That's a sculpture of Mary Wade that hung in a gallery. That's probably a poor choice of words. A couple of years ago. We know that the Mint has acknowledged Mary Wade, and of course there's the Legends Tees. Incredibly, I live on the Gold Coast now, and 3 kilometres from where I live is the company that sells those souvenirs. So I brought some down for everyone, or those that placed an order. And with that, I'll hand back to David.
Thank you very much.
I'll give
Stephen a big round of applause. We're very fortunate to have Stephen as part of our family. He's a great researcher, and the good thing about the research that Stephen does, and I learnt this from the last Port Macquarie reunion, was that he'll put something out there, do some research, put it out there, and then if he discovers it's wrong, he'll tell you. He'll say, no, forget that, that's wrong, this is what I found since. And that's a good researcher, so, you know, congratulations, Steve. That's great.
Thanks, mate. Cheers. Thanks for inviting me.
The other thing that I just thought of, and you were talking about one of our lines of descendants was actually one of the first 58 to land at Gallipoli.
Wow.
They were actually killed on the beach, so on the first 2 barges that hit the beach. And in 2 weeks, I'm taking a photo of all of us and I'm burying it in Gallipoli.
Oh, wow.
Okay, probably legal to do that, but I won't tell if you won't tell. Okay, now, so I've taken a photo of all of us, and I'll probably take the official photo later on this afternoon, and that's probably the one that I'll take with me back to Gallipoli.